8,000 soldiers have been standing in formation underground for over 2,000 years, and almost everyone who has ever looked at a photograph of them has been told the same simple story. They are guards. They were built to protect an emperor in the afterlife, a final act of devotion carved from clay and buried in the dark. That story is not wrong, exactly. It's just incomplete in a way that changes everything once you understand what they're actually standing on top of. Because underneath those rows of silent soldiers is not a peaceful resting place. It's a sealed chamber, flooded with enough poison to kill anyone who opens it, surrounded by the remains of the very people who built it, and shadowed by a purge so brutal that an entire generation of a royal family was erased to make sure the throne stayed secure. The army was never just there to guard the emperor. It was there to guard what he did to get that throne, and what he did to keep it in death. By the end of this video, you won't be able to look at a photo of the Terracotta Army the same way again. Every year, millions of people stand at the edge of those pits and stare down at rows of clay soldiers, and almost all of them leave with the same simplified version of the story. A powerful emperor, an army built to protect him, a remarkable feat of ancient craftsmanship. That version isn't false. It's just the version that fits neatly on a museum placard, short enough to read in the 30 seconds most visitors spend in front of it before moving on to the next pit. The real story doesn't fit on a placard. It barely fits in a single video. It involves forced labor on a scale that's difficult to comprehend, a purge of an entire royal bloodline, and a poison so effective that it's kept modern science locked out of the single most important chamber in the entire complex for over 2,000 years, with no end in sight. Most people who visit this site or scroll past a photo of it online fixate entirely on the warriors themselves, but the warriors are the front entrance to something far larger. The full underground complex spans an area estimated at nearly 40 square miles, and archaeologists who have spent decades mapping it now believe the man who built it wasn't simply preparing for death. He was constructing a complete, functioning duplicate of his empire underground, a backup version of his entire world, perfect and permanent, in case the one above him ever fell apart. To understand why anyone would go to that length, you have to understand who this man actually was. His name was Ying, and in 221 BCE, after decades of relentless war, he became the first person in history to unify China under a single ruler, taking the title Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. He standardized the currency, the writing system, the width of cart axles, the very measurements people used to weigh grain. He built the earliest version of what would eventually become the Great Wall. By almost any measure, he reshaped an entire civilization in a single lifetime. But the same ruthless efficiency that let him unify a fractured continent also made him one of the most feared rulers in recorded history, a man who trusted almost no one and who built his final resting place with that same paranoia baked into every inch of it. The clearest evidence of that paranoia is something soil scientists confirmed decades after the tomb's rediscovery, and it's not speculation, it's documented laboratory data. In the early 1980s, a team of Chinese researchers took systematic soil samples from the area directly above the sealed central tomb, the one chamber inside this entire complex that has never been opened by anyone in over 2,000 years. What they found were mercury concentrations dramatically higher than anywhere else on the site, and higher than naturally occurring background levels by an enormous margin. That result lines up almost perfectly with an account written roughly a century after the emperor's death by the historian Xi'an, in what remains the single most important surviving record of this period, the records of the grand historian. Xi'an described the tomb's architects engineering rivers of liquid mercury to flow continuously through a miniature model of the emperor's palace and territory, recreating the rivers and seas of his empire in liquid metal flowing forever beneath the earth. For centuries, that passage was treated as poetic exaggeration, the kind of detail a historian adds to make a subject sound larger than life. The soil data says otherwise. The mercury is real, and the readings are consistent with exactly what the ancient text describes, sitting undisturbed and slowly leaching into the ground for 2,000 years. That single detail is the reason the main tomb has never been excavated, not out of a lack of curiosity, but out of basic survival math. If that chamber were open today, whatever pressurized, mercury-saturated atmosphere has built up inside it, across 2 millennia would vent into the open air almost instantly. Mercury vapor at the concentrations the soil data suggests is acutely toxic, capable of causing serious harm within minutes of exposure. What could become the single greatest archaeological discovery of the modern era could just as easily become a mass casualty event before anyone had time to respond. Someone had to source it, transport it, and pour it into that chamber in staggering volume, all while working inside an enclosed space that would have been slowly poisoning them the entire time they built it. Modern toxicology suggests it's entirely plausible that some of the very craftsmen who engineered those mercury rivers suffered from chronic mercury exposure long before the tomb was ever sealed. A grim irony given how carefully that same substance now protects their work from ever being disturbed. The emperor built a defense mechanism so effective it may have quietly injured the people constructing it, and then outlasted every single one of them by 2,000 years and counting. And that's before accounting for the second problem researchers have already witnessed firsthand. In the 1980s, when a smaller subsidiary pit elsewhere on the site was opened for the first time, conservators watched the painted colors on the clay soldiers, pigments that had survived intact for over 2,000 years in a sealed, oxygen-free environment, begin flaking away within seconds of contact with open air. The sudden change in pressure and humidity triggered a chemical reaction nobody could stop. Whatever color those figures were originally painted was gone before anyone could preserve it. If the main chamber contains the silk, wood, and painted surfaces the ancient records describe, opening it could destroy the very history it's meant to reveal in the same instant it's finally seen. So the emperor's tomb sits exactly as it was designed to sit, sealed, poisoned, and untouched, guarded by a hazard so effective that modern science, with every tool available to it, still can't safely get inside. But the Mercury is only the first layer of what this place was built to protect. And the story gets significantly darker the further you move away from the tomb itself and toward the people who actually built it. The historical record states that roughly 700,000 laborers were conscripted to construct this complex, a number so large it's difficult to fully process. Construction took decades, spanning most of the emperor's reign and continuing even after his death. People arrived from across the newly unified territory, and for a long time, the assumption among historians was straightforward. Once the work was finished, the surviving laborers were simply released and sent home. But that assumption doesn't sit comfortably next to what Sima Qian actually recorded about what happened at the moment the tomb was sealed. According to his account, once the emperor's body and the tomb's treasures were placed inside, the outer passages were closed while workers were still finishing the final layers, and then the middle and outer gates were shut and sealed permanently, trapping an unknown number of laborers and craftsmen inside with no way out. The stated purpose, according to the same account, was simple and chilling: to ensure that no one who had detailed knowledge of the tomb's layout, its traps, and its treasures could ever reveal that information to the outside world. Whether that account describes something that happened to every laborer, or a much smaller number involved in the tomb's final, most secretive sections, is still debated among historians. What's not debated is that the text explicitly describes the deliberate sealing of living people inside the complex as a documented act of policy, not a rumor invented centuries later. To put that scale in perspective, 700,000 people represented a genuinely staggering portion of the entire population of unified China at the time, pulled from farms, villages, and conquered territories across the empire and funneled into a single construction project that lasted longer than most of them had been alive. Some historical accounts describe the workforce as a mix of conscripted laborers, skilled artisans brought in specifically for the terracotta sculpting work, and convicted criminals sentenced to hard labor as a form of punishment, effectively turning the tomb into a destination for anyone the state considered expendable. For decades, these people lived and worked in conditions that ancient records describe as brutal, even by the standards of the era. And when the project finally reached its final, most sensitive stage, the historical account is explicit that concealment took priority over mercy. The very people who understood the tomb's true layout best, the ones who could have drawn a map from memory, were the ones the sealed gates were specifically designed to trap inside. Wooden trigger mechanisms, after all, should have rotted away within a few centuries at most, long before anyone modern would ever get close enough to test the claim. But archaeological surveys of the tomb's outer structure using non-invasive scanning methods have identified metallic signatures in the layout consistent with crossbow components in exactly the positions Sima Qian's account describes, embedded in the walls of the access passages leading toward the sealed chambers. The wood may be long gone. The bronze fittings, it turns out, are considerably more durable, and they're still sitting exactly where an ancient historian said they'd be, over 2,000 years after he wrote it down. If the tomb itself was built to punish anyone who physically tried to break in, the emperor's response to people who challenged him with ideas was, if anything, even more brutal. And this part of the story doesn't require any scanning technology to confirm, because it's one of the most infamous documented events in Chinese history. In 213 BCE, on the advice of his chief advisor, the emperor ordered the mass burning of texts across the empire, targeting historical records from rival states, philosophical works that contradicted state ideology, and virtually anything that preserved knowledge of how the world worked before his unification. Only texts on practical subjects, agriculture, medicine, and divination were spared. A year later, following that purge, the historical record describes an even darker escalation. Several hundred scholars, accused of spreading ideas critical of the emperor or of practicing forbidden divination in his name, were executed by being buried alive. The exact number recorded varies slightly across ancient sources, but the event itself, remembered in Chinese history as the burning of books and burying of scholars, is treated as established historical fact, not legend. It stands as one of the starkest examples in recorded history of a ruler attempting to control not just territory, but the entire flow of knowledge and memory itself, deciding by force what history would and wouldn't be allowed to remember. What makes this episode especially chilling in hindsight is how directly it connects to the historical record we still rely on today to understand this exact period. Sima Qian, the historian whose account we've been drawing from throughout this entire story, wrote his history roughly a century after these events, working from surviving records and oral accounts passed down by people who lived through, or narrowly survived, the very purge being described. In a very real sense, we only know as much as we do about the burning of the books, because enough fragments survived the burning to eventually be reconstructed. The emperor very nearly succeeded in erasing the historical record entirely, and the version of history that did survive exists specifically because it slipped through the cracks of an operation designed to make sure nothing like it ever could. That obsession with control extended into something even stranger the longer the emperor's reign went on, a genuine, well-documented pursuit of physical immortality. Ancient records describe him sending massive expeditions, some carrying thousands of young men and women, out across the eastern seas in search of a legendary island where immortals were said to possess an elixir capable of defeating death itself. He consulted alchemists and mystics for decades, consuming substances his advisors claimed would extend his life indefinitely, some of which, based on later analysis, likely contained mercury and other toxic compounds that may have hastened rather than delayed his death. Several of those expeditions never returned, and the fleets simply vanished from the historical record without explanation. Historians have long speculated about why. The most straightforward answer is the obvious one, that they were lost at sea, victims of distance and primitive navigation. But there's a darker possibility that fits uncomfortably well with everything else this man is documented to have done, that returning empty-handed would have meant standing before the imperial court and confirming publicly and undeniably that the most powerful man in the world was going to age and die exactly like everyone else. In a court where failure carried consequences as severe as the ones already described, never returning at all may have been the safer option for everyone involved. When the immortality expeditions failed to produce results, the emperor appears to have turned that same obsessive energy toward the tomb itself. And this is where the story stops being only about a burial site and starts looking, according to some historians, like something closer to a machine. Every element inside the tomb complex, the Mercury rivers standing in for real rivers, the bronze chariots built to scale, the ceiling of the inner chamber reportedly inlaid with pearls, arranged to mirror the constellations, the clay army arranged in exact military formation was positioned with total precision. The soldiers don't face in a random direction. They face east, toward the territories of the states the emperor had conquered during his unification wars, as if even in death he remained positioned for the next campaign rather than at rest. Some historians argue this reflects a genuine ritual belief that the entire complex functioned as a kind of engine, a structured environment meant to sustain the emperor's spirit and power in the afterlife exactly as it existed in life, rather than simply a passive resting place. Whether or not you take the spiritual framing literally, the architectural intent behind it is unmistakable. Nothing about this tomb was designed to be peaceful. It was designed to keep functioning, keep guarding, and keep controlling indefinitely. And that brings us to the part of this story that has almost nothing to do with Mercury, crossbows, or clay soldiers, and everything to do with what happened to the emperor's own family the moment he died. In 210 BCE, the emperor died unexpectedly during a tour of the eastern provinces, far from the capital. What followed was one of the most consequential cover-ups in Chinese history, and it's documented directly in Sima Qian's account. His chief advisor and a court eunuch concealed the emperor's death for weeks, transporting his decomposing body back to the capital, hidden inside a covered carriage, reportedly surrounded by carts of rotting fish to mask the smell from anyone who got close enough to notice something was wrong. During that concealment, the two men forged a letter in the dead emperor's name, ordering his eldest son and presumed heir, a prince named Fusu, to take his own life, while installing a younger, more easily controlled son, known to history as Hu Hai, on the throne instead. Fusu, believing the forged order was genuine, obeyed it, and died before he ever learned the truth. What happened next is where the purge becomes something closer to a massacre than a simple succession dispute. According to the historical record, once Hu Hai was secured on the throne as the second emperor, his advisors moved to eliminate every remaining sibling who could potentially challenge his legitimacy, and there were many of them, since the first emperor had fathered a large number of sons and daughters across his reign. Ancient accounts describe multiple princes executed outright, and in one particularly brutal passage, 10 princesses were put to death together, their bodies dismembered in the marketplace of the capital as a public demonstration of what challenging the new regime would cost. An entire generation of the imperial family, the direct blood relatives of the man this entire underground complex had just been built to honor, was systematically erased within months of his death by the very court that was simultaneously overseeing the final sealing of his tomb. The chief advisor who orchestrated the forged succession letter, a man named Li Si, had spent decades as one of the most powerful and trusted figures in the empire, the architect behind many of the emperor's most sweeping reforms, including, according to some accounts, the very policy that led to the burning of the books years earlier. His reward for helping install a puppet emperor he's believed he could control was, within a few short years, his own execution on fabricated charges, ordered by the same court eunuch he'd conspired with in the first place. Betrayal in this story was never a single event. It was the operating system the entire regime ran on, from the laborers sealed inside the tomb, to the scholars buried for their ideas, to the princes and princesses executed by their own brother, to the architect of the cover-up himself, eventually consumed by the same machinery he'd helped build. The 8,000 soldiers standing guard underground were, in a very real sense, protecting the legacy of a dynasty that had already consumed itself from the inside before the tomb's outer gates were even fully closed. It's worth sitting with everything this complex actually represents. Once you put all of these threads together, this isn't simply the story of an elaborate burial site built by a powerful ruler. It's the physical record of an entire system of control. Workers sealed inside to protect a secret, scholars buried alive to protect an ideology, ships sent away and never allowed to return to protect an image of invincibility. And finally, an entire branch of a royal bloodline executed to protect a throne that, historically, barely outlasted the Purge itself. The Qin dynasty, for all the brutal efficiency that built this tomb, collapsed entirely within just a few years of the emperor's death, undone by rebellion and the same fear and resentment that its founder had spent his life cultivating. The empire the Mercury rivers were built to recreate in miniature didn't even survive one generation in the real world above ground. Which brings us back to where we started, to 8,000 soldiers standing in perfect formation, facing east, staring out across territory that no longer exists, guarding an empire that collapsed not long after they were sealed underground with it. They were never simply there to accompany an emperor into the afterlife. They were the final layer of a system built entirely around control, sealing away the workers who knew too much, the scholars who thought too freely, the sons and daughters who might have challenged the wrong person, and finally, the emperor's own body, wrapped in enough poison to keep modern science out of his final chamber for over 2,000 years and counting. So here's the question worth sitting with, after everything we've just walked through. When you look at a photograph of that army, rows of individually sculpted faces frozen in permanent, silent formation, are you looking at a monument to what one man built, or a monument to everyone and everything he was willing to destroy to build it? Because based on the historical record itself, not speculation, not fringe theory, but the actual documented accounts written within living memory of these events, the honest answer might be both at the exact same time, standing in the same formation, facing the same direction, for the same 2,000 years. What part of this story surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. Because this is far from the last sealed secret hiding beneath a monument. The whole world thinks it already understands. There's something worth remembering the next time you see a photograph of that army, or any ancient monument that's been reduced to a single iconic image everyone recognizes, and almost nobody actually questions. The version of history that ends up on a postcard is almost always the simplest, safest version available, the one that requires no context, no discomfort, and no follow-up questions. The real version, the one buried in soil samples and forged succession letters and the confessions of executed laborers, rarely makes it that far. Not because it's been hidden by some grand conspiracy, but because it's simply harder to fit onto a plaque than a story about a powerful emperor and his loyal guardians. And if this is the kind of history that actually deserves the word incredible instead of the watered-down version most documentaries give you, you already know what to do before you go. Subscribe, because there's a lot more sitting beneath the surface of the monuments you think you already know, and we're only just getting started uncovering it. Every case in this series takes weeks of cross-referencing ancient records against modern research just to get right, and there are dozens more stories sitting in the research queue right now, each one stranger than the last. Until the next one, stay curious, and I'll see you there.